Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good day. Greetings and salutations, and a little bit of welcome sprinkled right on top of that to the Safe Room featuring security side quests. I am one of your hosts, Tristan Watty. I am followed by Russ. How's it going, Russ?
How you doing? Hope everyone's having a good Monday.
Yeah, I like to change it up. Yeah. Happy Monday. And hello as well. And for you who are new to the stream, let us reintroduce ourselves. So I am Tristan Watty. I'm coming to you from the AWS Professional Services team, specifically in the security division, where we help to accelerate customers' journey in a secure manner, fashion, and form. And Russ, where are you coming from?
I'm coming from the customer incident response team. We help our customers with security incidents, help contain, mitigate, and remediate. So if you have any trouble, you come visit my team.
Yeah, exactly. And Russ will have open arms, welcome you to say, hey, I'll help you out. But here's what you have to do next. And as always, we always like to know, where are you dialing in from? Where are you listening from? Where are you tuning in from? Where are the visuals reaching you today? And if you would like a second question to answer after that, we have an interesting one. And that is going to be, would you rather want to fly or teleport? Feel free to put it in the chat. But I throw it to you, Russ. Which one do you pick?
So is this like your regular fly versus regular teleport? Or is this one of those ones where you can only like fly as fast as you can walk or run?
Yes.
Okay, so
Yes,
so you're throwing
exactly that
conditions.
Yeah. So and while it takes,
so I think generally I'd pick fly if I was able to do it quickly, but if not, then I'm gonna go with teleport. I think that the experience of flying would be fun, but teleport would be just so much more useful.
Yeah, it's interesting because if there's no debuffs on you, then it's like, all right, which one would I rather do? Then you're like, oh, teleport, I'd be right there. And then if there were debuffs, like, hey, I can only fly as fast as and long as I can run or walk, and then teleport, something occurs, like either a shock or something like that when you teleport, then it starts to get a little bit more interesting. But we also have a couple of items. Teleporting would be more useful, but it would be fun to fly. Exactly. And we keep going through for efficient relocation, teleport, visual, interest, fly. I like the little differentiate, right?
I love when everyone's got to break it down.
That's a good one. Well, the interesting thing is, and I always like to look at this, is it's either, are you more about the destination or the journey, right? So when we look at it through that lens, we start to think about, what else is about the destination or the journey? And that's where we get into this week's episode, the segue.
Well done.
Yes, 10 points to Gryffindor. But Russ, where did we come from last week that brought us to this segue?
Yeah, so last week was our up, down, left, right, encrypt, deliver episode, talking about AWS secure messaging tools. This week is going to be very similar. We're going to be talking about AWS secure messaging solutions, but our episode today is level 99 encryption enabled. So we're going to discuss a little bit more advanced topics. So we're going to go a little bit further into like encrypting the queue, security architecture, stuff like that. But I don't want to get into too many spoilers.
Yeah, you don't want to teleport there, right? So, and hello, Victor. Let's check who is the more effective, right? We'll see you there. But as Russ was saying, is we want to go through what are the next steps, right? Pretend we're flying. We're going, in a linear fashion a little bit until we go off the rails and then come back and then have to teleport. But if you look at what we're going to cover today, it's more of where do we come from a message security toolkit standpoint, I would say, right?
Yeah.
we tried to establish some of the fundamental items from the last and the previous episode by talking about some encryption technologies, IAM access controls, VPC network isolation techniques, things of that nature. But we want to take it one step further beyond and talk about maybe some advanced queue and topic encryption. We want to talk about event-driven architecture a little bit more because it's a very important concept to kind of get down as you try to figure out how you fly across or how you message. I'm just going to keep using that analogy until you get to the advanced integration patterns. And the trick is, what you want to do is you don't necessarily want to jump from one piece to the other. You want to enjoy the journey and kind of step your way through, right? Because this gets into some complex security scenarios. Because when you think of enterprise messaging architectures, you have a number of developers, you have a number of administrators, and everything in between that, right? So you want to understand how, for example, multi-region KMS key configurations work. How would you do that? Are there performance considerations that need to have special considerations, right? You say it twice, it comes true. But to start off, I think a good place to start is where we like to, and that's with a poll, right? So as always, if we're level 99, well, what's our starting encryption gear? Or what is your starting encryption gear? To kind of kick us off, feel free to put 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the chat and let us know. Russ, what are you starting with? What is your default equip?
So I'm going to go with KMS Shield as my starting encryption gear. I think, when we're talking about gear, in my opinion, I think your shield is kind of like your base defense. And so I would go with that, like as your base level defense. Can't get much simpler than hold something up and protect yourself. So I do like KMS for that aspect.
Yeah, it's a good place to start. It's funny because I lean towards the aura farming, right? The mystic row, the event bridge, right? Where you start to chain things together in a way that makes sense for your organization, especially from a security standpoint. Right? Because when you look at the ebb and flow, and this kind of comes up to, I guess I work backwards from the TDR approach, right? It's just like, okay, how do I automate something like my logging within my environment? And it's like, all right, if I have control tower, I'm centralizing logging. And then from that, it gets sent somewhere to a centralized, maybe data lake or security lake, something along those lines. Then it eventually ends up in your SIM type solution. So I think of, where does EventBridge fit into that? And that's kind of where I start to go. And Victor also says, I also have some dev strategy. Victor, so you're somewhat of a developer yourself. That's what you're trying to say, right? If I put it in meme terms. But thank you for always the comments. But I think we need to take a step back, but a little bit closer, right? Because we want to dive in a little bit more into that security toolkit component, right? So first place, we mentioned it a couple times, KMS. When you're thinking of encryption, you should start to have kind of a split mindset, right? For lack of better words. Are you going down a symmetric route or asymmetric route? So when you think of symmetric keys, you think of 256, AES, and that kind of fits the majority of your scenarios when it comes to AWS messaging, right? Because when you start to go down this route, you start to consider, okay, what am I heading towards? What is my North Star? What is my target state security strategy? And the symmetric keys often provide strong encryption with ideal performance for the majority of your use cases. Asymmetric, I would say, is useful when you have message producers that are external to AWS, right? So something that can't call KMS directly, for example. I think that's kind of the differentiating point I would make with that. But that leads you to go down and understand your different toolkit pieces. And then after you think, okay, KMS was something I heard, next thing that starts to pop into your head, maybe identity. What is the IAM policies I need to have, the key policies, and how can I put them together like peanut butter and jelly to make a defense in depth strategy for my organization, right? Because key policies can control who can use and manage KMS keys. Meanwhile, IAM controls the broader service permissions. So when you put these combinations together, you often have a defense in depth strategy, or one of the pieces, I should say. Right? You got that one circle in the middle. And then you start to go down a little bit further into the rabbit hole, as we would say, with the VPC endpoint policies, things of that nature. But that's really some of the fundamental items. And if you start to deter from any one of these points, I think having a North Star like architecture or the security reference architecture, the SRA, things of that nature will definitely help you out to understanding how all this pieces together. But Russ, I would ask you this. Why does encryption matter in messaging? I think that's a good point to start off with in this, as a recap.
Yeah, I mean, there's multiple reasons, right? I'm going to start off with what I think is, the biggest reason to encrypt is you're sending data over the public internet. If you don't want people to be able to read or access that data that you're sending over the internet, encryption. It's at this point, it's kind of security basics. Encryption at rest, encryption in motion. There shouldn't be a point when any of your critical data is completely unsecured or just plain text. Not in 2025.
Yep.
But yeah, it's definitely a fundamental for a reason. Trying to prevent that sort of man in the middle type of threat, addressing the basic kind of allowing your open data over the internet. And we even went over quantum encryption earlier. So if your risk profile is high enough, then you might want to be doing even more than just basic encryption in KMS. You can still do quantum in KMS, but you know what I mean. Like it's all dependent on your risk profile and what you're trying to do. Like when we were discussing our poll question earlier, we didn't really go over the other aspects of that, but the SQS and SNS encryption, especially if you're using AWS primarily for those purposes, that might be a higher priority for you than some of the other things. So it definitely depends on the context and your environment, but to be able to kind of at least knock away those easy wins, encryption is kind of a pretty standard. Yeah.
And for all the compliance folk out there, shout out to everyone out there from compliance. I think that's also a big part of it, right? And part of your overall, pick your regulation. Majority of them have something around encryption. To Russ's point, you don't want somebody to say, hey, look up at the cloud over there. Is that a piece of data? Oh, let me just sit in between this really quick, right? And this is kind of where you start to get into understanding encryption at rest, encryption in transit, and why you need both, and the compliance reasons, everything Russ was saying, right? But your strategy is often influenced from an encryption standpoint by your data classifications, right? Because not all messages need the same layer or level of protection, right? So sometimes it helps to take that step back, as we like to do, and think about, okay, what's public, what's internal, what's confidential, what's restricted, and how can we optimize this for our security resources? Because one of the big things is performance and what you need to accomplish. What outcomes are you trying to strive for outside of just the normal, I just encrypt everything, which is the important concept base. But at the same level, do I understand what I am encrypting, right? Because there's different attack vectors. There's different mitigation strategies, things of that nature. Because when you start to get into messaging, now you have to start to think of, okay, how do I prevent malicious messages from entering my system? And how do I do that? Well, I have to validate the message structure, right? And before that's happening, okay, now we're starting to get into DLQs, and we start to get down the path of, all right, authentication, authorization, things of that nature. So all those things start to pop into your head. But I think another key place that kind of gets overlooked is shifting from, how should I say this, isolated security to integrated security patterns, right? Because you're moving beyond the individual messaging components and you're implementing an end-to-end security pattern, essentially. And this helps to preserve encryption. It takes into account access controls, the entire message, your process workflows. And that's why I kind of picked the mystic robe of event architecture, right? Event-driven architecture, because when you think of that integrated security pattern, now it's built into your overall workflow. And now you can start to measure the effectiveness of your overall architecture, right? You can implement metrics and monitoring and your overall encryption coverage, those kind of things that, you think of the individual message. I have to do this, but you have to take a look at the holistic picture sometimes, right? So when you do that, I think it also stems and helps to get into maybe understanding some of the advanced queuing techniques and things of that nature, right? If I were to start out today, Russ, trying to figure out, okay, how can I take a step up in my encryption knowledge? Where would I start with this, especially with messaging and the services?
Yeah, so especially when we're talking about, our SQS and our SNS security, we have to talk about, our encryption patterns for SQS. So, we have both server-side and client-side encryption. Server-side being like a KMS managed keys or custom key management options. It's not just KMS. We say that because it's our service, but and then the client-side encryption, which would be something like a SDK integration with encryption or envelope encryption, something along those lines. Having those both is ideally what you're looking for. I wouldn't say that necessarily gets you up to the next level, but basically that's how you are at the level. And then using some of the best practices like rotating your keys regularly, that's going to bring you up to the next level. Ensuring that your access policy is designed appropriately for your environment. And then, like you said before, for our compliance folks, there's audit logging requirements as well. So a lot going on, but, just those basic strategies like key rotation and implementing it within your encryption, your access policies, which you use for every service, but specifically for, your SQS and as well as for your auditing. And then, especially with the auditing, I mean, we're talking about integrating with things like Security Hub and Event Bridge and tooling like that. But then when we look at, say, like security configurations for like SNS, that's when we start getting into, topic policy. So like using, for example, like principal-based access control or condition statements or something along those lines, which kind of adds to, which is just another configuration, on top of, encrypting on the server side, using like KMS for SNS topics or managing keys across multiple subscribers. And then also we have to bring it back to compliance as well. We have regulatory compliances, audit trail maintenance, All of these little things that we have to keep in mind when we're trying to increase our queues and our topic security. So this is the sort of thing. It's not like it's anything. Like the topic policy design and the encryption design is specific for this, but it's still taking foundational security practices, like make sure you're auditing your logs, encrypting your topics or your data. So it's kind of like just thinking about these things from a messaging perspective. There's a little bit of difference when we start talking about like the queues and stuff like that, but for the encryption strategy itself, is pretty, I would say. I mean, would you agree, Tristan, that it's pretty much across, all of your services, you're going to have similar-ish encryption strategies based off of your environment?
Yeah, and it's funny because when you think of your overall strategy, it would be similar, but it would be specific to your environment, right? Because when you're looking at, okay, what is my overall encryption strategy? You can even start with something simple like what is the message system versus message attribute, right? Where the message system encryption protects the entire message body, while message attribute requires kind of like a separate encryption handling. So when you're looking at encryption strategy, there's some attributes that can't go over 256 bytes, right? So you have to think about that when you're designing your encryption strategy. And you also brought up a couple of key points as well of, hey, what is the key rotation? Right? Because there's some applications that are developed in a way that, all right, we can't just rotate keys, right? Because maybe it's a lift and shift or something along those lines where a developer has to have hands on keyboard in order to rotate the keys, and they have to have a document that says this is how we do it because we can't enable automatic. Well, there should be some conversation on how to turn that application, but those are kind of things you have to consider of, okay, if we can't have automatic controls, what are the compensating controls that we can put in place until we can update our application accordingly? And I think that's all of the different pieces that you have to consider. And as Victor says, let's do encryption side, and I'll bring dimension 2, and I don't have to need for you can do. If I said that wrong, it's because I ran out of coffee as well. So, but I think to understand and kind of go into it is when you think of encryption, it's not just one thing you consider. So it's similar across the board, but you have to develop your strategy according to your needs. And in order to find out your needs, you kind of have to lay out everything, right? So when a developer starts to develop your applications, they have a playbook. They have an understanding of the different services, like what SNS does, what SQS does, what KMS does, right? What all the S's do, right? So they can get to a point of, okay, this is how I'm going to use it in the environment. And that's why we usually say, hey, when you are trying to develop your ecosystem to put into place the guardrails that are needed in such a manner that developers can explore, but there's some restrictions and boundaries in place that, hey, this has to be encrypted. You want an S3 bucket needs to be encrypted, messages need to be encrypted, all those kind of things, and build them into your pipeline. So automation fails at a point if you don't have these mechanisms in place, and fix it until this gets deployed into some of the upper environments that you may have. So all these are considerations, and I think that's some of the common pitfalls as well that organizations start to get into of, hey, we need to develop this application and it needs to have this amount of latency. It needs to have these restrictions, so on and so forth. And there's a disconnect between the business outcomes and the technical outcomes, especially from an encryption standpoint. So when you think of the services that you're using, you have to look at what are some of the defaults built into the services. I mean, by what are some of the quotas, right? KMS has some default quotas built into it. All the different services have these items that you have to consider Because if you do not architect with those in mind, then you start to run into issues down the line when maybe you go from, X amount to a higher amount. Now that you run into some issues and you have to try workarounds that eventually, right? So I touched it with, but you have to create workarounds that are long-term in nature, right? It's not just, hey, let's just do this and get it over with, right? So there's so many factors in it. And then cost also comes into play with a lot of the conversations. But I think a place to start, as always, is understanding, all right, where did other organizations come from? And the way to do that is maybe finding out some customer stories or some legends that you may have heard in the past. And for that transition, we always like to give the little round of applause, or at least I do. But also dive deep in with our favorite side quest music, because as Side Quest legend has it, we continue our story of our organization, FinTech Express, right? Because Express was what made it cool sounding. But they implemented some basic security controls. They helped to start off their encryption strategy. And while they had the basic AWS KMS encryption in place, you start to find out, hey, when you start to develop your encryption strategy, you start to figure out there's some additional challenges I have to consider. There's additional context management. There's cross-region key handling. There's performance impacts, especially when you're talking about encryption implementation. So if we think about our company, FinTech Express, they put in the basics, but now they're trying to level up to 99. How do they do so? Well, they start to think of, what are our blind spots in encryption? How do we handle something like cross-account message flows? How do we adapt our AWS infrastructure? Well, I think the only way to do so is to go on just a tad bit of a side quest. And with that, we have our side quest board. And if this is your first time joining the side quest board, it's a visualization of our tale, our story, our legend that we are trying to solve for today. And feel free to answer the questions that we pose right there in chat. Or if you have any questions, feel free to ask. But I asked Russ the first question is, if we have our FinTech with the basic, let's say, KMS strategies in place, now, if we're trying to get to level 99, usually when you're at level 99, you have a trusty legendary weapon. I think that's how most games go today. So they have the basic KMS in place. What would be your legendary weapon that you would choose if you were to compare it to an AWS service?
So I don't think you might have not expected this one, but I'm going to go with Cloud HSM, or as we call it in our notes, the Sacred Shield. I think Cloud HSM, having your own HSM instance within a private VPC can really bring you up to that level 99. I think that's what I'm going to go with.
Yes, that is a good choice. The Sacred Shield, Cloud HSM, often a service that sometimes organizations don't consider because they're not in a highly regulated industry sometimes, and they're like, oh, we'll just use this. But I think it's a good place to start for most organizations, especially if they have different challenges, right? Like inconsistent encryption methods or key rotation complexities or cross-region key management, things like that they start to boil down to. And I personally tend to go towards the ancient relic, which I say is Secret Manager, because it should be there. It should be present. It should be that thing you kind of strive towards, especially when you're thinking of level 99. But I think it's part of the encryption strategy, because if we look at FinTech Express and continue to go down the route of understanding, okay, they had started on their encryption journey, so now they're trying to take it to the next level. So what we have noticed is when you start to think about all of the challenges, there's usually an equation that you can kind of put into place. What is that equation? Well, variable issue challenge plus AWS service equals solution, right? Simple. Until you don't know what the service you're supposed to use is. So when you think of your encryption strategy, I tend to think of it like, okay, if it was a final boss in a video game, if it was a raid boss, something like that you wanted to tackle, that helps you to frame things. I know it sounds weird, but if you think of something like, all right, we have our encryption, our KMS, and we have to, let's say, note that maybe we have some SQS. And I, again, use the handwritten note because it's appropriate for this topic. But when you have something like SQS that you're supposed to encrypt, that you're supposed to protect, what you want to get to, what you want to strive towards is an understanding. What is that understanding? Is, hey, what is the event-driven architecture we could put into place that helps, one, accelerate things, but two, create something repeatable that you can update, that you can establish some guidance for, right? Because one of the things that usually organizations start to not implement is the governance and guidance for the developers and people who are leveraging these services, like SQS, right? So the other thing is, yes, and Sai sees where it goes, Event Bridge. So when you start to think of something like Event Bridge, you start to see and manage, hey, if an event happens within the organization, now you can trigger alerts. Now you can automate some of your workflows, and you can start to feed into something like a step function in order to answer, whether it's from a security standpoint, an application standpoint, or anything in between. Because you're going down the route of understanding. Enhanced key usage auditing, something like that. But if you were to compare your last boss, your raid boss, or something like that, Russ, what would you say your last boss, and compare it to something, right? When it comes to key management or performance or something like that.
Yeah. So as an incident responder, I want to say key management. But for some reason right now, I feel like the performance issues is kind of overlooked a lot by security teams, especially because, we know that security is important, it's vital. And sometimes we don't really take into consideration, how our security, tooling or architecture really affects your environment, and how that affects the actual performance of your instance or account or whatever it is. So I think that can be something that security just doesn't keep in mind, that we want to be as as little intrusive as possible. And so I think that monitoring for performance issues should be maybe not a final boss, but definitely a raid boss.
Yeah, and that is a good answer, because when you start to think about those items that are overlooked, that's exactly where you want to go, with understanding the gaps within your organization. And sometimes little components, like something like CloudWatch that we put down, is a big piece of the puzzle. I was going to say component. I gotta stop saying component so much. It's another piece of the puzzle that you're trying to figure out. Because if you look at our overall flow, it's a simple one. But each one of these have a lot that goes into it, whether it be KMS encryption or SQS and everything we were talking about, the step functions, CloudWatch. All these are different items, different paths that you can, delve into a little bit. Because there's a bunch of different combinations that you can hit with this, where you can have something like KMS and the Cloud HSM that we spoke about. You can have something like multi-region and auto rotation set up. But the important part to consider, to think about, is that we have to pause the game with the Zach Morris timeout and kind of take a step back, as we like to say on this show, and get to the point of, hey, how do we better set up, and we keep going towards the event-driven architecture because we're proponents of automation. How do we stop maybe some click ops? How do we increase and level up to 99? And part of leveling up to 99 is having automations in place that, one, alert you, two, make it easier for you, and three, helps you to just attend to things faster. And we say faster, but the reason why we say that, because you don't have to go in there and click through different regions and accounts and things of that nature. That's part of the governance strategy of your organization. So you want to understand what event-driven patterns you can implement, what event-driven security patterns that you can have. So when you start to think of, hey, maybe there's some content-based event filtering to the earlier point of Psi is, hey, if we use event bridge rules with content filtering patterns, we can route based on the payload of that content. So you start to think about it, right? Now you start to say, hey, there's a lot that we can do just by tweaking a little bit of our automation, because then this starts to create content-based authorization beyond just the regular IAM controls, because now you have automation from the content standpoint, right? Event driven. Then you can start to figure out, okay, maybe we can have an event bridge pipeline that requires separate IAM permissions. Now you start to see where we're going with this. It starts to break down to a point where you can have so many things. You can have the Lambda, the step functions, because you have the overall workflow carved out in such a way that you understand what data pieces there are. You understand the patterns that you have. And now you can say, okay, I understand this account. Now, how do I do cross account? And how do I encrypt this between the different accounts, especially from the workflow perspective? And I would pose this question to you, Russ, is when you're thinking of integration with other AWS services, what pops into your mind first when you think of, okay, I have to integrate with other AWS services from an event-driven standpoint?
So a couple things come to mind. This is where I think custom key policies, starts to flash in my mind. But if we're talking about, working within integrating services, also the multi-region. So, being able to use, your keys in whichever region you're working with, or multi-region, which, hopefully following best practices you are. But yeah, I think that's those are the two that come up for me, like immediately, would be the custom key policy.
Yeah. And it's interesting because when you think of custom key policies, my mind also goes to, okay, what are the different handoff points as well, right? So if we have an event-driven architecture, my mind goes to the APIs. And then when I hear API, gateway is not far behind that. And then you start to think of, okay, if we're sending events to an API gateway endpoint, now, okay, what does the handshake look like? What is the TLS, the mutual TLS authentication method, something like that, right? Because then you have the API keys, you have the Lambda authorizers, things of that nature. And there's a whole bunch that you can get into with that. But usually this is the case when you have multi-cloud environments, you have SaaS partners that are involved that you have to have some of the security considerations with, right? So you have to have these additional layers in place, because if you're coming from outside the AWS environment, now you have a potential gap if it's not accounted for, because you might have, hey, everything in your back end is AWS, but your front end might be a partner, some other SaaS provider, something like that users log into, and then they make the calls to the back end through API gateway, and it goes from there. But there's considerations that have to come into that, right? What is your logging mechanisms? Do you have something like CloudWatch logs, and are they encrypted? That's a big question, because now you start to think about, okay, CloudWatch logs, and okay, are there metric filters to detect security like anomalies or something along those lines? Those are all big parts of the puzzle. And if you're thinking of understanding your messaging architecture, another piece that is often not talked about or spoken about as much is something like X-ray, right? Where you can trace across your overall architecture to track the encrypted messages. And you're like, why would I want to track encrypted messages? Well, you want to maintain that security content, or I would say context, throughout your organization's workflow. So you want to use metadata that helps identify potential security issues without exposing sensitive information. So X-ray, right, comes into play, something like that. So I don't know, have you seen on your side from the IR standpoint, kind of the use cases for X-ray or CloudWatch logs, and any of your findings or dealing, how that could have made a difference if there was better coverage with them, if you know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely. Especially when I think that, specifically when I see incidents involving like SQS, a lot of the time people are, or not people, but some of the customers are using or relying on, Cost Explorer to see a spike. And that's not really a monitoring technique. That's,
Yeah.
bad things have already happened at that point. So yeah, you can't always rely on, cost or billing or seeing a massive spike in traffic. Especially because at that point it's too late. We'd like to get left to the boom. So I usually see a lack of these tooling, and that can lead to missed expenses. Someone's going to rack up a lot of money, with your phishing attempt. You could also see reputation score go down for your domain. A lot of things that could be prevented. If you're just utilizing some of these, especially what you were talking about earlier with the automation. I think that's huge. I think auto remediation is really the goal in automating IR, and being able to get as close to that as possible, even if it's just the first couple of steps, saying like, hey, if this happens, then pull this VPC down, or block this domain, or whatever it may be.
Mm-hmm.
Just having those steps and starting the process before human eyes can even look at it is huge towards really maturing your security profile.
Yeah, and you also bring up a couple different good points, and I think we have a poll that might also add to that piece, right? When you think about, hey, how do you track your encryption failures?
Mm-hmm.
This is an interesting question that I would pose to, one, chat, but two, figuring out how you go about this. And I send that question to Russ. Which one do you pick? 1, 2, 3, or 4?
I would pick 3 or 4 if given the opportunity. A lot of the times as an incident responder, I don't get that. And I just have to deal with the CloudWatch logs. But there is still a lot of good information you can get from those logs that'll still allow you to get a baseline, or, see anything that deviates from that baseline. So if it's in conjunction with other services or tools or metrics, CloudWatch logs, but ideally you'd have a little bit more information, a little bit more context. So I'd go with 3 or 4.
Yeah, definitely. I would go with 3, just because I feel if you have custom error metrics, that means you went the extra step in order to get those custom metrics into place. So you're a little bit more mature within your cloud journey at that point. Because when you think of tracking encryption failures, that means one, you have an encryption strategy, hopefully. And then two, you use that strategy in order to create custom metrics, opposed to kind of some of the entry level type steps where you have, okay, CloudWatch logs, we have them, great. What do they do? Do they go to the SIM? Do they go somewhere else? Right? Things of that nature. And then Victor says, Sandbox can't fix that. And probably after the CloudWatch, you can effectively use the other tools also because you have the data. Yep. Exactly. That's the important part, because when you think about, okay, where do the logs go next? That's usually the part of the flow that is disconnected, because what we often see is we have an infrastructure and platform team, and then you have the security team. And within that, they have different goals where, hey, we are doing everything inside of the platform and the VPCs or wherever the case may be. And then the security team is in charge of the governance and the tooling, where that handoff is an important part to consider. Because, all right, when you think of the TDR standpoint, where we have kind of a TDR bias here, you think of the entire workflow from the log generation all the way till it gets to your preferred SIM solution or something along those lines, and how your incident responder is going to respond to that. Is it, hey, this alert was generated, it pops into the SIM, and then that SIM generates maybe one, auto remediation, or two, a link into maybe a playbook or something along those lines of what steps they should follow. Those are all pieces of the puzzle, right? And I think that is something you need to consider when you're thinking of your next step, especially from an encryption standpoint, because what does an IR responder do where it's like, oh, encryption alert comes through? So I think that leads into your overall one, pattern recognition from a security standpoint, but maybe some of the integrations, I would say.
Yep.
Right? Because that's an important part to also think about, is like, how is everything working together, especially if you're just IR support and you're like, okay, I have an alert. Where do I go? Well, I gotta figure out everything that was touched throughout the architecture. Right. So where would you start with that, Russ, when you think of integration patterns?
Yeah, so especially from an IR perspective, when you're talking about integration patterns, I'm looking at the workflow. So especially, when we're talking about like multiple services, so for example, like just a simple one like SQS to Lambda, there's some different things that you have to consider in that type of pattern. So you're looking at encryption, and the encryption context propagation. You're looking at how you configure your IAM roles for KMS access, since the roles will be, your different services or workflows, and how they access, your encrypted keys. And then for this Lambda specifically, you'd have to make sure that you're handling the actual encrypted payload properly in Lambda, because that could be, especially if you're not, using keys maybe in the right way. Talk a little bit about key management across services in a second, but that could be a potential, if you're not handling that appropriately. And then, talking about going back to what you referred to earlier with the API gateways, like you said, API key encryption, is the actual payload being encrypted in transit? And then obviously the client-side encryption handling, because we would like to have standardized server side, but the client side can't be ignored either. So, so think different things that you think of for like integrating with the API gateway that, maybe you haven't had to consider before.
And optimization, right? I think that's one of the key points that I'm thinking of as you were going through them. Like, one of the pieces is understanding kind of your encryption patterns to get to a point where you have almost a hybrid approach, right? Where you have your sensitive fields that are encrypted while maybe the metadata remains in plain text to optimize that security performance ratio, where it allows the routing and filtering of the non-sensitive fields without requiring that decryption component. So it's those kind of items that you start to think about within your workflows overall. And that's kind of where you start to get to, is that complex multi-service encryption scenario. And to Victor's, I'm not scared about the audit failures due to a stream or a sandbox. Well, this would also be to the place where we're talking about the guardrails. So if you have a control tower environment, there's a particular section within the documentation that points towards sandbox environments and some of the guardrail considerations, right? Where you would ideally want a sandbox be somewhere somebody goes to learn about the services. They want to understand how the services work, but in a true sandbox, shouldn't have any connections to your overall network, right? It should just be an isolated item with some guardrails in place that people can play around with envelope encryption and seeing how it works and kind of how extremely sensitive data would be handled, right? Especially if you're trying to go towards that level 99 portion that we're trying to reach, right? Where you might have encrypted or nested encryption almost, right? Where you have messages that are encrypted multiple times with different keys to control, that two-layer access, because maybe you have multiple teams or systems that are able to do that for the particular reason of having that two turnkey approach. And that can be a more mature security technique. The other piece that popped into my head is data tokenization, right? As another use case that some organizations, usually within the highly regulatory fields, might implement just because of the nature of the business. But another consideration, I think a key part or place to start off with is, one, understanding the different services and how they work within just the overall environment. So that's an important context. And the way to do that, we always say, certificate knowledge, right? That's a big part. I'll clear up the space so you can see it a little bit better. And the next place is to go on a knowledge quest. And what is a knowledge quest? Well, it gets you to a point where you turn this type of music, where you're like, I need some guy, to more of, upbeat. You want to dance a little bit, right? Because a knowledge quest is essentially those little tasks that you like to do when you go off by yourself and you say, hey, I heard Russ and Tristan speaking about something. How can I dive a little bit deeper into? How can I get to a point where maybe I can build a little bit of, what do we say that is? Oh, aura, right? And how do you build aura? Well, you go to the documentation, you go to the different pieces and places that, level you up a little bit. So if you were to be something like a Q apprentice, as we call it, based on the theme of today's episode, you would start with, hey, what is a type of maybe introduction that we can take? What is the first step? Well, first step is maybe understanding something like KMS as a whole and how exactly it can be leveraged within your environment. So if you look at documentation of the AWS variety, you can start to go down and understand what KMS is and what are some of the key components. What is some of the language? What are some of the design goals that you need to have from this standpoint? So all these pieces of the puzzle you start to put together until you get to a point where, hey, I kind of understand this, but I want to continue on the path of developing a little bit more. And we spoke about this last week, but I think it's worth the call out again. And that call out is going service by service to help build one, your aura, but two, your knowledge, three, your overall target state security strategy. And in order to do that, you have to take it back to the basics sometimes. And that's the other way you build up, from a Q apprentice. And maybe looking at some basic SQS policies. It's a good place to start, because when you have multiple permissions that you need to grant, okay, how do you start with just one? It's usually like, oh, we need to do all this. No, how do you do it once? How do you do it once properly, and to the point that you understand, hey, what are the actions that I need to think about? What are the principal components? And breaking down the JSON in such a way that it's, one, easy to understand, two, it goes with your security strategy, but three, now you can start to look at how to expand it exactly. And once you do that, you start to level up to a pattern ranger. Not to be confused with a Power Ranger. The pattern ranger starts to go towards understanding, right? The putty action. I wanted to do the putty action, but I was like, no. That would be a bloopers episode. Right? That's what happens when stuff isn't encrypted. You hear the noises of the putties. But what you really want to go towards is understanding, okay, now we have our one account down. What happens when we have more of, how should I say, compliance needs, logging needs, things of that nature, where you have different API actions happening within your environment, and getting to a point where you can start to build in some of the automations. You can start to kick off like, hey, maybe we have something event driven that we have to figure out. Maybe we have event bridge processing within our environment. And when you start to think about all these different components, you eventually build up brick by brick until you can reach the level of a message legend, right? You could be a side quest legend, but message legend, right? You get from point A to B very securely. A key component of that is, one, understanding the overall architectural approach. And that's why we often say, hey, look at the security reference architecture. Because if you're looking for a cheat code or some foundational pieces to start from, the SRA is great prescriptive guidance for anybody to follow and refine their own policies with. And then eventually you can get to a point where you dive deep into not only the documentation, but the official guidelines. And why do I say it's official guidelines? Well, it's in PDF form, one, but two, you start to understand all the different components of how everything works and breaks down step by step in one document, that if you want to dive deep into a specific topic, like, hey, KMS and post-quantum key exchange in TLS, this is where you go. But I know sometimes you don't want to read as much. You just want to kind of dive in. And that's why there's some workshops. So one workshop we would suggest is the event-driven architecture workshop, where you start to go through an overview of just how you can implement something like event-driven architectures within your environment. But there's so much to dive into. But I think another place to start, Russ, is with one item and then work backwards from there. And what is that item?
That's going to be your incident response plan.
Yes.
Please make one. Have one.
Exactly. Encompass all the encryption. Encrypt your IR plan as well, right? Just encrypt it as well. Because when you do that, hey, you build up an experience point for that encryption, right? Anything counts. And then eventually, once you get enough XP, you level up yourself and your security posture. But feel free to come back next time to figure out how we level up ourselves and have fun while you're doing it.
What crazy question we have next week, you know?
Yeah. Fly over next week or teleport. But we'll figure it out next week. So till then, take care, everybody.